Let's get close, but not so close. You can share from a distance or in time. No, we want to see each other. You'll have to stay in your quarantine space while we talk.
Welcome to Quarantine. This is our 10th show, which means we've been at this for about 5 weeks. And we've watched both the crisis change and also kind of how all of us as an audience and the world needs to react to it. Hello, I'm Peter Hirschberg, and I'll be here today with my co-host, Mickey McManus, and with two prominent scientists, Ting Jiang and Andreas Weigand, both of whom are behavioral scientists and data scientists. And the reason we wanted to put this together today, guys, is because this is really the week that science has become kind of center to so much of what's going on. We realize we're being governed by these computer models. And it would seem that every decision we make is at some point a function of either behavioral, how people behave, economic models, complex systems models that model out how a pandemic might grow and the various factors that feed into that, and the underlying math. And the tension here is, even if you don't believe in that stuff, you may well be governed and a function of all of that. So today, we're calling this episode the scientific method. We could have called it just as easily, it's the data stupid, or we could have just looked at the fact that the culture wars now seem to encompass these issues of what science you believe in. And this, for example, the president fired a top vaccine researcher because he questioned chloroquine, which turns out not to perhaps have been safe. There's been a lot of conversation this week about the denominator. We know how many people are dying, but we don't exactly know how many people have this COVID-19 infection. If it's a very large number, then this may not be as lethal as the flu, at which point maybe we're overreacting. If it's a small number of people who have it, this could be a very lethal thing. But what we see here is there's a certain uncertainty because we don't yet have all of the data. And Kevin Kelly, speaking last week on the Long Conversation show, pointed out that at a time when we've lost trust in a lot of parts of society, people want to trust scientists, but at a time when the models and the data move so quickly, I think it's very difficult for our public in general to have, or for a lot of people to have faith in something when it changes all the time, and yet science is driven by experiments. So that's what we want to get into today. Mick, maybe you want to paint a little bit of a picture, and then Andreas, we'll be talking to you about your vast experience in data science. You were at Amazon, where 1% of the world was your experimental petri dish. Here, we're talking about the whole world as an experiment.
I'll just set up a little bit here, and thank you, Peter and Andreas and Ting, for joining us. We thought that this would be interesting now that we've gotten to this stage. Andreas wrote a book called Data for the People. After he was an Amazon chief scientist, he really started looking at what the implications were for people from a privacy standpoint, from a control standpoint. What was the difference between what we had and what for personal rights, but also what we needed to do for society. And when we were kind of catching up on this, we said, wow, he said this is like the biggest natural experiment of them all right now. And so we thought we would have his point of view on that at a broad, global, sort of deep data level. And then in some ways, the soft sciences, like behavioral sciences, how we understand each other, are some of the hardest sciences of all. And we thought, let's go down to how we're feeling, how we think about well-being with Ting from the Center for Advanced Hindsight.
I don't think we can hear Mickey.
Oh, that would be a shame. Andreas, just come on then. Omid, bring on Andreas if nobody can hear me anyway.
I can hear you perfectly, Mickey.
Oh, okay.
All right, Andreas, can you hear us?
I can hear you, Peter. I could not hear a word that Mickey said, unfortunately.
Mickey said, welcome to the show, and we're discussing science and its implications.
Right. I think one belief I have as scientist is to run experiments. So I think we need to change some parameter so Mickey can not only be heard by you, but also by me and probably by the rest of the audience.
Okay, well, here we're doing a real-time experiment. You can, Mickey, say hello.
Hello.
Did you hear that?
No, I did not hear that.
All right. Well, while we attempt to fix that, I'll translate. Let's begin, Andreas, with this. One could posit that what's going on in the world today is a giant experiment in the sense that we don't have a lot of certainty about all of the underlying data. We've written models for how we think things behave, and we have different countries and cities executing different approaches. Sweden's relaxed its social distancing constraints. Georgia in the US may be doing that right now. So as a scientist who has run experiments at scale with data, take us through a little bit about how you formed these things when you were at Amazon, and then how does the current world set up as a data experiment? What are the kinds of experiments that we are in fact running to bring greater certainty and management to this? And then maybe we can get into some of the implications of those, because since so much of this has to do with contact tracing and data, our views of privacy have probably advanced as quickly as this virus has advanced.
Yeah, great. So the scientific method at its heart means that you come up with a hypothesis that translates into an experiment, which you do, and then hopefully the outcome will tell you whether the hypothesis is correct or false. What we are seeing here, however, is what we call a natural experiment. It's not that somebody set up two groups. One is working this way, the other is the other way, but something happened. So the parallel from Amazon might have been, how did Amazon come up with the idea of free shipping? It turned out that in one European country, somehow we forgot to add shipping costs. So orders surged. And then we, of course, looked, how did it happen? And that turned out that having free shipping was a huge reason for people to order more. So that's the birth how from a natural experiment we learned, and we took it actually from a bug to a feature, if you will. So now here we have different countries reacting differently. And ultimately, none of us really knows what the right approach has been. I mean, we know what some of the wrong approaches are, and it's not to politicize things. It's not to use it as a surveillance tool, but it's of course to observe what is happening in the example you gave in Sweden, for instance, compared to California.
You know, if you think, as I've been thinking about all this, because there's been a debate raging all week about, are we overreacting or not? What's the right thing to do? And of course, it's become part of the culture wars. But it occurs to me, if you think of a complex dynamic system model where, you know, there are all of these factors, and then you have positive feedback loops that amplify things, right? A positive feedback loop is more people get sick, and then they expose more people, and the system kind of runs out of control until there's a negative feedback loop that brings it back into equilibrium. Like a lot of people already got sick and they can't do it again. But it almost strikes me that as a society, we've had so much order since World War II that we're negative feedback junkies, that we crave order so much, we'll do anything to pull that system in from overshooting or having a problem, to the point that we're really, you know, we're people might say we're sacrificing the economy in favor of trying to just make a natural system behave differently. And I'm wondering, kind of as a scientist and an experimentalist, like how you set these problems up, kind of ethics point of view, and like, just as you were counseling Jeff Bezos on how to run things, if you were kind of counseling policymakers right now, how do you walk them through the unknowns and the fact that small changes to a system could have big outputs, but it's not all predictable? A lot of uncertainty here.
Right. There were many things in what you packed in here.
Yeah.
So let's decompose this. The first is the exponential growth. So it is actually very important to understand what this notion of an exponential function is. That it is characterized by its doubling time. So how long does it take from 2 rabbits to become 4 rabbits, 8 rabbits, 16 rabbits, and so on. So for example, in the computer world, the amount of data that's generated doubles every 1.5 years. So here, what is the time that the infection takes? That is one constant, which is super important in the model. If it's a year versus if it's a week, huge difference. What we learn here, that it's the order of a week or 2 weeks. I'm not an expert here, but I am an expert in understanding that these small changes we could have made at the beginning. And in some cases, the Chinese obfuscating what was happening and delaying the response of the world by weeks are literally responsible for millions of lives. So that is the nearby trajectories diverging exponentially idea. Now, the experiment we have here actually requires, and any measurement should require, starting with the action we can take. Scientists, physicists don't just randomly measure stuff in the world. They come up with an idea. And so here, when we talk about tracing and tracking, we need to come up with an idea of what do we want people to do. Example, in Singapore, I heard, people's names are published who are positive on the virus. What good does that do? You could have an app that just tells you were for 3 minutes within 5 meters of a person who tested positive. So really deeply thinking about what do you want to do in response to the outcome of experiment is something which is very close to my heart.
Well, in fact, let's talk about this. It does seem to be that after we get over emergency, there was this wonderful essay this week called "The Hammer and the Dance," or I guess last month. Basically, said we start with the hammer, we quarantine, stop the economy, put everybody away, and then the dance is we come out and start figuring out what to do, but not let the system go crazy again. And a lot of this has to do with the combination of contact tracing, who have you been with, and whether you should be quarantined again. Whether or not you have symptoms, and also kind of having people rely for that. So certain places like Hong Kong have issued wristbands, right? And if you leave your house, it's kind of like the bracelet you put on a prisoner. Singapore has similar stuff in the US where we crave personal freedom and liberty, but we've heard that Facebook and Google are beginning to build cell phone things. So let's talk a little bit about what's actually being done in other parts of the world, what we might expect, and how that experiment would come to being and what data would give us.
So I think it's super important to make trade-offs explicit. Here, that of personal freedom, of civil liberties, versus public good, versus public health. And I think in a democratic society like ours or like Germany, the discourse needs to be on how do we want to weigh the individual terms. That's what we need to get consensus on. If we say one of these values is infinite and we ignore the rest, we'll have disastrous outcomes, like the old interview question. What would it take to make airline traffic 100% safe to not ever having a plane take off? So it can't be at the extreme. So we have to understand what are the trade-offs. And data literacy for me means that people are aware that they need to put numbers in front of terms. And what we should negotiate is, what are those numbers? Now, that's not the first time that this happens. For instance, the MELT score, an end-of-life disease score, which determines who should get the next liver transplant, for instance. Their wise, well-meaning people got together and decided what are the different elements we want to take into account, what weight should we give them, and then at the end of the day, they compute a score, and based on that score, they determine the actions.
This week has seen the kind of data we're looking at swing in the orders of magnitude. Bill Cleary just pointed out that in Santa Clara had a study that said perhaps people have the infection 40 times greater than is calculated, right? So if that's the case, then the denominator, the number of people who had it, is much larger. So the percentage of people who are dying, it could be within the range of the flu. Whereas that original, I think it was Oxford or one of the universities in UK, predicted much higher death incidence. So we had policymakers and people operating off of one set of very conservative numbers, like, but now we're seeing things that could be 1 or 2 orders of magnitude different. I mean, I understand this is science, right? I mean, because yes, we need better data, but how do you approach a model when you literally have so many moving parts that the underlying data is changing and your assumptions are changing, and then you have to make policy decisions?
One of the key things about being data literate is to understand that there are measurements and errors. Any physicist learned in their first year of studies how errors propagate. So unfortunately, in many cases, we need to overly simplify things at the end, like stay home, save lives. But before we come to such a decision, there are lots of errors. And this Stanford Santa Clara study here, where people apparently didn't use the right sampling techniques, and I haven't actually looked into it, is a wonderful example of seeing that modeling is an art. Knowing what should be in the model is just as important as knowing what should not be in the model. Where do we draw the boundary of the model? I mean, why do we build models in the first place? Because it's easier to manipulate numbers than it is to manipulate the world.
Walk us through a little bit of what Hong Kong and Singapore have done, and then when we might expect that. That seems to be important for opening things up.
Right. So I happened to talk to a friend in Hong Kong 3 nights ago. And in that conversation, he showed me his wristband. And it said some number. And he told me that he's not allowed to take it off. And then I got a message from him 2 days later that 2 police showed up and knocked at his door. Why? Because the wristband connects to an app which was on his mom's phone. And his mom forgot to answer the phone or to charge the phone, so the phone was off. So what the authorities assumed was that he somehow left the area he was confined in. So he landed Hong Kong maybe 10 days ago, and basically needs to stay within an area. Now, I love data much more than I think models, but what are the data they collect with that wristband? Basically, they're looking for all kinds of electromagnetic signals in the house. In my case, it would be my laptop, which has Bluetooth, which has Wi-Fi, my router, of course, maybe my neighbor's router, the mouse of my roommate. All of those are signatures that know you are in your home. So yes, I might take my laptop with me if I leave, but I can't take my neighbor's laptop with me. So it's a very interesting, not GPS-based, very interesting method of figuring out from the signatures around you of whether you are in that area which you said you would be when you first measured it out with that wristband and the Apple phone. And the app on the phone.
What do we think is coming here to the US?
Here, I think the approach is different. I've heard that Google and Apple are working together to look at Bluetooth signals. So in my book, Data for the People, which, by the way, during COVID time, I make available for free. I give people the postscript for free if they want it. Viking.com/en. That's my last name.com/en for the English version. So in the book, I'm talking about many data sources. There's, for instance, a satellite company which makes nanosatellites in Glasgow, sends them to space, and it observes ships because every ship emits electromagnetic radiation. Your radar, for instance. So there's one story last year where one of the ships approached North Korea and then they took off the beacon. But all the other things were still actually radiating because you can't turn off the entire communication on the ship. They knew then it went to North Korea. A few days later, it left, and then it turned on the beacon again. So I love those things where, whether you want it or not, you are emitting data because you need to do what you need to do, and those data can be picked up.
Well, and in this case, there's been a lot of what we call effluent data, right? There's the company,
Yes.
the thermometer company that's been monitoring stuff. Descartes Labs, the satellite company, has been picking up a lot of stuff. But when we try to get down to this granular bit about, at some point this has to resolve to people, right? It's kind of like, who have I been in touch with, and am I safe? And then at some point, do I have the antibodies? At which point we're all going to be labeled in a class called Peter's safe or Peter's not safe. So, okay, now we take American society, we put people in two classes. So that might not work out well, but maybe this is the exact kind of experiment that's necessary. Certainly other countries are doing it. So I'm kind of wondering, operationally, given the fact that we all walk around with cell phones, will we come into something where perhaps you're not allowed into public buildings if you're not opting in?
Peter, maybe I can remind you of a talk you and I gave at the United Nations about 10 years ago.
Yeah.
Where we talked about people's cell phones in Africa and how the cell phone location data, not smartphones, just by which base station they are near, the data the carrier has, how that can be used, for instance, to determine where a health station should be, because many people pass through there. They might not make this explicit, but their phones are passing through there. So similar things about data that people create in doing whatever they are doing might be useful here to learn things and to help us come up with good actions. But ultimately, it's a problem for society. How do we make sure that those surveillance techniques that are now employed do not linger around once COVID is no longer a problem? How do we make sure that governments do not use this opportunity to yet put another foot down and then create more fear and get people to go, like my father had to go to prison in East Germany for no real reason, besides that the government didn't like him?
Yeah, it's worth pointing out here that these conditions of a great deal of uncertainty, right? So we kind of began this conversation by saying, even the best scientists are off by a great deal on, what the R factor is or what the death rate is. When you have a lot of uncertainty, that increases fear. And in fact, Skinner has done experiments, right, that shows that in his case, it was pigeons were the best supplicants when you starved them and you gave randomly, didn't know what to expect. And it strikes me that these conditions we have now are perfect for kind of authoritarian behavior because people are scared, don't know what to expect.
Yeah, if I was a dictator, I would rejoice in the virus because it now gives me a way to have more fear on the people.
Yeah. Okay, well, on that happy note, Mick, why don't we bring Mick in? Because I know you've got some questions about some of the technology being used.
First of all, Andreas, can you hear me now?
Yes, I can hear you. Thank
you,
you,
Mickey. Great. So, and Omid, can you pull in my whiteboard for a second? I don't know if yeah. So I've been trying to keep track of the conversation, and there was this comment that Andreas made about personal liberties versus the public good, and making that very explicit. And I want to just get in a sense of, the first question is how do we do that? In other words, what are things you've seen that have worked in terms of allowing people to have this trade-off? And then the second part was, we talked about sort of, will you wander through the streets, the emissions, kind of that you can't help. They're sort of not spoofable because they're emissions from stuff that's around our entire body. There are Wi-Fi waves passing through my body right now. It feels like that's almost like a digital fingerprint that has nothing to do with my finger, but it's actually to do with my living. And you said something about how do we make sure that we don't oversense now for the public good, and we can put the genie back in the bottle, or at least tell me a little bit about positive ideas you have for giving people sovereignty over their information, or helping balance these two things?
Well, I gave you one example, which was to not say who it is, who you met, who was positive, but just to tell you that you met a person and to be focused on the action you need to take. So an example.
So that was sort of shame versus information. Just don't shame people. You mentioned something even about going in and buying a bottle of liquor. What do you really need to communicate when you go in and buy?
Right. In Germany, when you want to buy cigarettes, and I've forgotten what age you have to be, you insert your ID card, your Personalausweis, and then it doesn't read your entire ID of it, but it just gets the one bit. Is this person of an age where they can legally buy cigarettes, or are they too young? And that's very different here. Just yesterday, actually, Amazon delivered some stuff for me, including booze. And they wanted to see my ID, which of course is funny. You go out, you put it somewhere, and then they scan it. And I thought, why do they need to know my entire ID? I mean, first of all, they can look at me and decide on whether I'm 21 or not. But then secondly, I am not comfortable in them taking much more information than what they actually need. So for me, part of the education of getting people to become more data literate is for them to have a mental model of what the other party needs in order to make the decision, as opposed to just give me everything and, trust me, I won't put it anywhere.
Yeah, I think that's really critical. And you mentioned that sort of, if you were a totalitarian government or a despot, a dictator, you'd be pretty happy right now, because you can do this overreach, and what kind of policies would help us make sure that we're not overreaching?
Well, Mickey, from 2001 to 2017, I had a house in Shanghai. I was Jack Ma's data coach in the very early days of Alibaba. I worked with Tencent. So I think I have seen an authoritarian regime using the data that people create. And in some way, Tencent is very honest that, what you do on your WeChat is not just between you and the other person, but assume that the government is reading it. A friend of mine who I greatly admire for his journalism is Josh Chin. Josh was one of the journalists. He was the deputy bureau head of the Wall Street Journal in Beijing, who was thrown out of the country last month. And he has deep thoughts on surveillance, and in a wonderful talk where he shows what he sees on WeChat and what the other party sees or didn't see on WeChat. So in China, people are very aware of it. Here, I don't know in Facebook's case whether it's often just incompetence or why things don't appear. I'm not so sure, but it would be the time if there were bad intents to really take advantage of them.
Well, and I think your point is that at minimum, people were pretty much aware and very clear that they knew that she or the government is going to see everything. And so you have and I think but I mean there's a separate part here, which is probably that they're much more it's much more community focused. We have this exceptionalism of the individual in America, and there's a little bit more kind of equanimity, I'm bad at that word, but just about kind of being a part of the community, and it's the community, not the individual, that matters. So it feels like there are different things there.
That's what they say, Mickey. But I think the objective function, you could argue, in the United States is to make sure that the Facebooks of the world are doing well. You could say in China, the objective function is to make sure that Xi Jinping is doing well. And maybe I have the hope that in Germany, and that Angela Merkel asked me to serve in her advisory board, her digital advisory board, about 1.5 years ago. I have the hope that in Germany, with a PhD in science as a chancellor, that given the amazing speeches she had given the last few weeks, that there is still a country that actually doesn't just optimize for companies or for themselves, but optimizes for the people. As I always say, data of the people, data by the people, data for the people.
Oh, wow. I love that. I
up-
think this is a perfect place to end. And I think this notion of optimize for the people, when you said an objective function, so in data science, there's sort of an objective function. There's what is the goal that the AI is reaching for, and you train it to kind of reach for that goal at all costs. And this notion of an objective, well, okay, there can be multi dimensions to it.
That's where your intelligence has to go in. What is the objective function? And that's, of course, where we differ with Facebook, where the objective function is to have you watch crap for as long as possible so Facebook can make as much as money as possible, which is not the objective.
We headed into this crisis. We headed into this crisis with a very rich conversation about that. You follow Tristan Harris or Roger McNamee and the fact that surveillance capitalism or extractive capitalism, these online services that began kind of idealistically because they were going to connect us, right? They then resolved around their business model and became extractive, right? And now we're in this tender moment where we have conditions that could accelerate that. And we've been so busy having an emergency and wanting to prioritize, say, security over these liberty issues, right? So the other interesting thing here is to watch federalism. Will this happen because the United States makes a decision, or will California be more science-based and some combination of our governments and Gavin Newsom may be an experiment here as in fact as other states are. So that's another, I think, interesting thing to look at. Let's come back to you in a little bit, and Mickey, I'm going to throw it over to you to set up the conversation with Ting. We've talked about these kind of large natural experiments, large data sets. Ting is a behavioral scientist who is doing actual controlled studies to understand how we can understand behavior and move it along, particularly at a time when we may need mass behavior change in the middle of a pandemic.
Yeah, let me set up a little more about what Ting's doing, and then we'll bring Ting in. If you think about it, you don't hang out with quarks and photons and electrons like as buddies every day. You don't hang out with qubits if you're not a quantum mechanic or a quantum scientist. You don't hang out at that very small level. You hang out with other people. And so you don't think of yourself as an expert in quantum mechanics unless you're actually an expert, or unless you've actually put in the time and become either a theorist or an experimentalist there. But everyone thinks they're expert at humans because we have good habits. I've got a good habit. I've got a bad habit. I could probably change a few things. I think you should lose weight because I think she's got this or he's got that, because we are in ourselves and we're sort of living in ourselves every day, and we're part of a family. We had either a bad or a good experience. These soft sciences, the things that actually have to do with us, behavioral science and social science, we think we're all experts in. And it turns out our intuitions serve us pretty well most of the time. They keep us alive. These things that we call cognitive biases are just shortcuts so we can make decisions in uncertainty, and we've got old wives' tales, and we've got like parables, and last Friday we talked about religion and ritual. Those evolved to keep us alive as a species. They're shortcuts. Sometimes they're past their sell-by date. Looking for sugar all the time was great when we were hunting mammoths. Not so great. Same set of biases get triggered when you go into Las Vegas, and the house always wins. So our intuitions are different than evidence. And Ting and the Center for Advanced Hindsight effectively says hindsight's 2020. The problem is foresight's really tough. And how could we actually build capacity so that we don't have decision myopia? We don't have short-sightedness for the future. And it turns out they've been able to discover that you can actually build capacity. You can build better habits, but it's hard. And so we thought, let's bring in Ting and have her explain a little bit about how the soft sciences might be the hardest sciences of all. And how could we do deliberate experiments with a sort of theory-driven approach during this time? Because we probably are normalizing a bunch of not great habits sometimes, and maybe we're discovering some better ones. Let's bring Ting in. Hey, Ting, thanks for coming back.
Hi.
Hey, as we bring Ting in, I just want to remind people who might be tuning in that you're watching Quarantine. This is the 10th edition of our show. And today we're focusing on the scientific method, and kind of how it is experiments and data science, behavioral science, that's really driving the decisions that are being made here. And now we're in the second half of the show, so I'll turn it back to Mickey and Ting as we dive into the behavioral science part of it. If you want to know more about us, we're at quarantine.today, as are all of our previous shows. Back to you, Mick.
Thanks. I really actually bring in Ting. Ting, I'd love to give you center stage now. So tell us a little bit about where your mind is at right now and what you're working on and what your focus is.
And also thanks, Andreas, for the fascinating arguments about also China. I might want to have an offline conversation with you later. But so first of all, I do want to say how scientific thinking and method is what we believe something that everybody can master and can make use of. In order to be more deliberate in our data gathering and where we pay our attention. I think we are terribly overloaded by information and choices these days. It takes up so much of our cognitive bandwidth, and it doesn't leave us enough room to make important personal decisions. And it's really not just the intention that matters for becoming smarter in what data that you want to collect or even generate yourself. But it's an important thing to keep in mind that it takes technique and maybe even scientific thinking and method to be able to do that. So intention itself might not be enough. And so I would love to share with you some of the past works that we have done just as a way to illustrate how we generate meaningful data and how we interpret those data, how we set up our data collection in a way that we already know how to interpret them and how to make the best use of them. So this is just a little bit of participation that I'd love to have you do with me. So we have a case in Kenya where we try to get people to save 100 shillings every week for 24 weeks. So they have this mobile wallet, which is a great technology, and it turns out that not a lot of people save, right? So here we have 3 interventions, and I'd love to for you to vote which one works better or works the best. So the first intervention is monetary incentive plus loss aversion. So this program deposit 20 shilling in their account and tell them that if you save your 100 shilling, which is about $1, you get to keep it. If you don't, we'll take it back. So pretty, generous interest rate plus, it feels painful that if you have to lose something you already have in your account. Secondly, we know that people love their kids, right? So we use a SMS reminder and say, hi, daddy, please deposit as much as you can for a future. Thanks for saving, and your daughter, Jane. And then lastly, we have these 2 gold coins. We actually made it in China, so it was very cheap to produce. And it represents 24 weeks. So we say, if you save that week, scratch it off. If you haven't saved in that week, underline that number. So now, Omid, I'd love for you to kind of give people the chance to participate in voting which option works the best. And we'll give it a few seconds.
Yeah, Ting, I'm sorry, Omid, bring up the polling screen, and everyone can go to pollev.com. It looks like 1 vote's in there, so we'd like some more votes. And actually, I'd love Peter and Andreas to vote as well. Do you think 20% matching? In other words, you'll actually get 20% from the bank if you put in some money, and if you don't put in money, you'll actually have that feeling of loss, or the messages get sent from the kid to the parent to kind of help save some money or make some money, or you get a gold coin that kind of keeps track of things. Which one do you think would be most effective to actually lead to savings? And if you're just joining us, go to pollev.com/cogcap, and you can put in any kind of name you want there, a screen name or something, and go ahead and vote. Let's wait. It looks like 100% of people think it's 20% matching and loss aversion. Pretty interesting. We don't have enough votes yet. Now, this was an actual experiment, Ting, that you ran, or
So
that your organization ran. And so you do have, now somebody thinks maybe messages sent on behalf of the kid. That's kind of that, come on, Dad, put some money in for me. You know, I got to go to college someday. It's evolving a little bit. Everyone go ahead and keep voting. Let's see if we can get a few more votes on this. A gold coin that tell me about the gold coin. Is it actually a gold coin? Is it a scratch thing? Or
I think it costs $20. We made it in China. So
but it's like a card that has gold coins on it or something.
It's literally it's metal. It's metal.
Oh, it's metal. Heavy. It is. Okay.
It feels really heavy. Yeah.
I see. But do they keep them in their pocket? How do they do the gold coin? What happens with that?
Yeah, so they just we give it to them outside of their household, and we ask them to keep it somewhere visible during their day.
And they can like deposit it basically at the end of the week. And if they do that, then
because it's a mobile wallet, so they can deposit on their phone.
They scan it, or they I see. Okay, great.
Exactly. Yeah.
Okay, so we're still. It looks like, I mean, a lot of people are like, well, if you were to give me 20% matching, why would I throw away money? So it looks like that's
loss
what
aversion
people
is
think.
the thing, right? So we know
and loss aversion.
Yeah, so we really don't like losses.
Yeah. Interesting. Okay, can you tell us what really happened? I'm kind of curious. Like, does this match? Did we do a pretty good job? Are we a good crowd?
So it turns out that we also did a poll with mechanical Turk workers, and interestingly, I think our participants have a bit more betting on kids. Everybody from our mechanical Turk population thinks that the pre-match one is pretty powerful.
Yeah.
And this is the evidence. So we also, of course,
have so actually this is what we saw, and this is what the evidence is. Okay.
Yes. So it turns out,
so it wasn't the pre-match. Tell us about that.
So it's the exact opposite as we intuitively thought. And so we expected the coin to work really well, but we didn't expect that it would work almost twice as good as the other two. And we'll come to that. And I'm actually going to go into a little bit of a theories of how we make our decisions, and then we can come back to explain why this is the case. And in a nutshell, it really matters why, when we are not saving enough, or when we are not doing social distancing, when we're not doing hand washing, what is the underlying behavioral barrier? Is it because we don't know that it's best for us to do it, that we don't have the motivation to do when we try to exercise more and we don't manage? Is it really lack of motivation, or is it something else, right? So understanding that core barrier really can help us find also the most effective solution. And this is the diagnosis part of scientific thinking and method. And then the experimentation really shows how we can test and tweak it. So let me quickly give you sort of how we kind of approach these problems. And as you know, in African region, 1 in 3 die from treatable illnesses, 1 in 26 children die from diarrhea. So if you just even save a little bit, it's enough to save their lives. And so in another program, we have this saving for healthcare. And it turns out that, a lot of people signed up. We have even 2 million people within the first year who downloaded the app and have it, but they save very little, right? So we were approached by the chief marketing officer of MTBA and say, hey, can you help us? And so what would be the intuitions that we apply? Right, again, the monitoring incentives. So they have save 100, get 50 SMS reminding people how important it is, radio campaign, and how would a science-based approach look like? So we first did a diagnosis. So we map out the behavioral journey in order to kind of deposit regularly in this mobile app. And you see here, there's like green, yellow, and some of the barriers really come from our intuition, and that was not a problem at all. But what we do in addition is that we try to collect data, right, to validate these barriers and use data and evidence to really inform whether the barriers are there or not. It's not like, we have this workshop and everybody did post-it note, and depending on how many people have that same post-it note, that we would actually, assume that was the barrier, right? So it was a co-creation of using intuitions, but also scientific findings. And then we basically try to rank this barrier and try to narrow down what's the core barrier. And so in this data collection and how we actually map out the barriers, we're also not just like randomly, right? So we try to map out barriers according to this framework, which is lacking intention versus intention behavior gap. So we know that actually a lot of the intuitive gut feelings about why people don't do something is lacking motivations. And that's where like a lot of the, when in 1990s, we had this campaign to get people to eat more vegetables and fruits. And it turns out that the entire campaign, taking years, helped people really improve the knowledge. But in terms of behavior, nothing happened, just because it's not because they didn't know that this is good for them or that it's important to eat more vegetables and fruits. So this intention behavior gap is really something that is more automatic. And it can help us explain a lot of the phenomenon, a lot of the data where you see like a lot of people make New Year resolution. It's like a long list of them that we're familiar with. And again, even in COVID-19 time, we know that it's important to keep fit. But how many people actually manage to keep up with our good habits, change our bad habits?
Yeah, how many people like 3 months into the new year actually are keeping their their New Year's resolution?
1/3 gave up after a month.
Yeah.
Right.
So I mean, I think here though, when you said type 1 and type 2, or
system 1, system 2, right?
Or system 1, system 2, a part of that is the motivation side. Like, do I have enough information and am I motivated? Those engage our whole brain, and that's certainly what a lot of advertising campaigns are trying to motivate you, like eat more vegetables. But it's this gap between motivation and behavior and habit that's really in the type 2 part, I guess. Is that right?
Yeah, it's the basically the autopiloting part of the brain, which is if you can see, there's a lot of it's not following heuristics.
Okay, here we go.
And and it's actually evolutionary rational, because we
kind of like the lizard brain.
Of decisions. Yeah, there's a lot of decisions are repeated, they are trivial. And so we cannot afford to like spend really our deliberative, right, intention.
So it's very hard to put a new behavior in, because that's like the lizard brain, and we get, it needs to become a muscle. And so a good habit is hard to make. It's good for you, but it's hard to make. And I've heard people describe this as a bad habit is easy to make and hard to live with, and a good habit is hard to make and easy to live with, because we've got to get it out of the brainy, thinking about it part. I'm going to think all the time while I'm driving, but then, I kind of daydream, and it goes back to my lizard brain, and we have to get it into the habit side. And so a lot of times people try to attack the motivation side, but really they haven't helped you build a better habit. I just want to make sure everyone's following this, because I think this is really important.
It's also important to realize that a lot of the sort of subliminal influence, and even when we think about sort of data interpretation, a lot of times we're following our heuristics and we're being anchored, right? So if you are asked to kind of make a guess about a bottle of wine, what's the price? And if I ask you like, hey, by the way, tell me your social your ID, security number, and then depending on whether your last 2 digits is in a higher end or the lower end, you're gonna actually make a higher versus lower price guess of the wine. So that's
right. So even though your driver's license number, your social security number has nothing to do with the price of wine. Right. It's just recent. It's in your head. It's been loaded in there. And the next time you're asked a question with a number involved, you just go pull it. Mine is 57, so I just go pull 57. Yeah. And someone who might have seen a 19 would actually be looking for a lower value in wine or something. Let's keep moving. What are you working on now that you're excited about?
Right. So maybe so before I quickly go into that, I just want to say that so this is exactly how. So we use data to show that it's actually not the intention that matters, and then we basically use these kind of field experiments to test, which one works better. So it turns out that people simply forgot. So, when we test it, it turns out that, it really works better. But then, some of the SMS that we sent was also counterintuitive. For example, this one, you would think that adding a message about, again, monetary incentive is helping them more, motivating them more, or getting them to save more. Again, there's no difference, right? So another sort of field experiment example is that there is already a calendar that people receive, and if you can kind of bring in sort of a social norm stories into the calendar instead of the brand image, we found that this was able to kind of drive savings by many times. So the control group was not saving at all, and then the story group actually was saving much more. So this is just a point to say it's very simple sometimes to embed an experiment in an existing product or an existing platform, just to collect evidence and use scientific theories to sort of drive those behavior. But let me quickly go to the study that we are running now in Holland. And so it turns out that the elderly in Holland were really feeling stressed about the COVID-19, and so we were invited by the national TV program to help them design something that can help promote their well-being. So we have different disciplines: cardiology, longevity, behavioral science, and then we have all these different parties. So of course, it was difficult to sort of merge these different disciplines. And more importantly, there are a lot of guesses about what they need at the moment. But instead of just relying on, the intuitive guesses, we decided to go for some data collection. And it turns out that people also don't exactly always know what they need. So if we ask their life satisfaction, right, they would say, well, I'm doing pretty well. Nothing is going wrong. If you ask them what is like ideal versus like, how much you are doing, say, exercise or hobby in your past week versus in an ideal case. So you will find that they would find a gap of there's not enough exercise, there's actually too much news, there's actually not enough hobby time. But rarely kind of, people would report really like being stress and anxiety being something that they need to work on. But if we really look closer onto, behaviorally, right, like, can you stop thinking about COVID-19? A lot of people would say, yes, I can't stop thinking about COVID-19. And we found that there's the anxiety level actually associated with this greater reported inability to stop thinking about COVID-19. Moreover, if we look at sort of, the data of how much they talk about COVID-19 versus just, meaningful conversation, 50% of the conversation were around COVID-19. So here we have now designed a game for allowing them to catch themselves when they have this negative emotion so that they can become more aware of what is actually less desirable for them. So in a way, sort of cultivating this possibility of their collecting their own personal big data, right? So here we ask them.
So this is like a little bit of a journaling or a diary study. And this will be, for millions of people in Holland, that particularly the elderly, and focused on, you can't ignore the negative feelings that you have. If you ignore them, that doesn't really work. So they are feeling these things. Go ahead and at least expose it, but kind of write it down and drop it in this thing. It's kind of like a bank of negative things, so that you can start to see how much you're thinking each day about those negative things versus the positive. And so sort of making it external as a little bit of a game. And games are powerful things because they have stakes, they've got rules, there's fair play, but you can simulate things and kind of learn by playing So tell us a little more about what happens here.
Yeah, so it turns out that we try to avoid sometimes being aware of these negative things because we are very judgmental about them, right? So we say, oh, it's bad about ourselves and about actually feeling stressed and anxious. So we make the game rule purposefully focusing on how many moment you become mindful? It doesn't matter whether it's positive or negative. The rule is actually to become one more mindful moment, to have one more mindful moment a day. So the moments when you catch yourself feeling negative, they were actually contributing to your winning the game. So in this game,
it's not punishing you for having bad emotions. It's just about being aware of these things. So sort of stepping out and seeing. And then I suspect on the positive side, like when you do something that really gives you pleasure, often we don't savor the pleasure either.
Exactly. So we ask them to write down also, positive and negative, and kind of deposit it in this glass. And also for the negative, of course, we don't want them to, in order to win the game, to kind of try to catch themselves as many negative. Also, it turns out that when people don't know what to do with the negative, they try to avoid it. But when they have an easy action that they can use to counterbalance, to offset that, they will be more likely to admit or be honest with it. So we say there's this magic cards that some of them we will create for you, because they might not know what's, some of the scientific proven method to sort of reduce stress and anxiety. For example, mindful breathing, right? So you inhale for 5, hold for 5, exhale for 10. And that was one of the magic cards that you can have. And then you can have some magic card that you create yourself. After you become more mindful of, like, what's really, making you happy, you can add those, right? But in the first week, you have to have these magic cards of exercise and breathing. And so whenever you feel negative, you put one in the negative part, but then you can draw one magic card and counterbalance that. And then now you get that positive feeling, and then you put it in your positive. Moreover, because people have actually, out of habit and automatic, piloting, talking about COVID-19, right? If you don't, the more stressed you are, the more you go for autopiloting. So we try to, let me just give this example. We try to kind of create also materials for people to have a cue, first of all, to talk about meaningful conversations. So this game, for example, it allows you to talk about questions that you don't usually think about. But they're also scientifically proven to sort of help you bond better with your conversers. And in this game, it's also embedded that you can actually draw a moment from the negative or positive account to share during the dinners. So this is part of the game as a way to also allow them to share. Also for our elderly, when they make a phone call, one of the social missions that we plan for is that for them to call up their daughter or loved ones and draw one of the positive or negative moments that happened in this past week that they can share. So
I'm curious about this. I don't know if you can hear me, Ting.
Yes.
Hey, Omid, can you bring me back in? So in a sense, one of the things we know, and certainly for, our grandparents and others, we know that social isolation is really tough right now. Yeah. And this notion of first, having tricks you could pull from the card, and it's sort of low stakes. It's just a game, and having a bank that makes it better, but also having an ability to pull out those moments that you noticed and share helps with social isolation, even if you have to share it over Zoom or something. And we know, I think the upshot of all this is that there is already scientific data that says that if you're depressed, and if you also are feeling lonely, and if you're also feeling high levels of anxiety, it actually affects your heart health, and it affects your ability to fight off immunity, have immunity and have disease.
Absolutely.
So it feels like that's kind of part of the thing, is this is scientific. I think I want to, it's coming up on 5 o'clock here on the West Coast. I think I want to open it up to Andreas and Peter as well. And we're probably what we'll do is go to overtime after this. I don't know, Peter, do you want to say something here? And then we'll kind of continue the conversation for those that want to hang on.
Yes, well, we're coming up on the top of the hour, but I think this would be a great time to bring everybody in. Ting, a question for you. So here you are at scale introducing these behavioral science techniques in television in the Netherlands.
Think you're muted.
Am I muted?
No, we can hear you.
Okay.
Yeah, we can hear him. Yeah.
I can repeat it.
And my question is, does this cause any friction across the other types of science, right? Because you've got behavioral science, you've got neuroscience, you've got medical doctors, and now you have all these different kind of experimental types colliding in real time. And I imagine that might cause tension across disciplines.
In fact, the experiment was postponed last week because one of the scientists didn't quite like the idea of gamification and thought that it was a little childish for elderly. And we actually have quite some experts in the team who worked with play and games with the elderly. But here, what's interesting is that he was proposing an alternative intervention that we actually knew from a lot of studies before within behavioral science that it's something that probably would not work. But it was something very intuitive, like from everybody's point of view. So TV people, everybody, when they mention this, they say, "Oh, this all makes sense. Let's postpone it." So I think there's also this like how much. And because he's a scientist, he's a top scientist, he's a very well-known scientist.
Yeah, well, and you guys worked through this in some way, right? You figured it out.
In different disciplines.
It was an example of interdisciplinary stuff. You actually have to work together.
Yeah.
But if I think I'm an expert in everything, I'm not humble enough. And I think that's part of the thing that we all have to learn is when it's interdisciplinary, when it could be both neuroscience and behavioral science and social science and all these other things. We have to have some intellectual humbleness, but you actually did work through that, and now you guys are rolling this out, and potentially we could try doing a trial in the U.S. with our viewers as well. As you're rolling this out, if you'd like to have us as another control group or something, I think there's this opportunity to kind of part of this is an important thing is part of the challenge when you have different kinds of scientists. Is just like I said at the beginning, because I'm a human, I think I'm an expert in humans. And so if you're a neuroscientist, because you study kind of top down how neurons work, you might think you're an expert in kind of these shortcuts that are used in society or used only when it's two people or used in certain situations. And it's a big complex space. That's why I said I think the soft sciences are the hardest science of all. And we've got a long way to go before we'll get there. Andreas, can you hear us now?
Yes, I can hear you.
Great.
So for me, I think it really boils down to curiosity, to us not assuming we know the answers, but to us focusing on the questions, to us being curious. What actually do we want to know? And then to be ready, whatever we are measuring. So for example, I've been very curious about what the temperatures are of things. And so let me just take your temperature here.
Can you tell my temperature?
Wow,
yes.
that's
See, I'm doing okay. How am I doing, Andreas? I feel like you got me right there.
Yes.
Where'd you get? Yeah. So you got one of those like laser things to test the temperature of things.
Yeah.
So you're kind of a junior citizen scientist, and that's good.
It was Peter's idea for me to go with my little name tag here, Dr. E. Weigand.
Ah, very nice.
Quarantine patrol through Muni, the public transportation here, and we all know about the laws we have that I can't just take pictures of random people. But can I take their temperature? So I have always been fascinated about the data we create. And for me, being in that crowd before somebody, approached me, motherfucker, get out of here, before I think, it went a little bit too far, to see how do people feel if you take their temperature.
So you did this, or you're going to do this?
No, now I wouldn't go to Mute anymore. I'm not sure if it's running. I did this, Peter. When did we first talk about this? 3 weeks ago?
You and I talked about this 3 weeks ago, and we thought it would be a form of guerrilla theater if you went out and just started shooting people's temperature. And it was... So
unfortunately, I can't hear Peter when he's speaking. I can hear Ting Jiang and Mickey, but I can only make out what he's saying. And I don't know how that happens.
So Peter, he can't hear you, and so maybe sign language and typing in the chat thing. But yeah, no, Peter said this is kind of like guerrilla theater. That was the idea. What happened when you went out and did that with the laser thing?
I think people were just thinking, what's his problem?
What the heck is he doing?
And also with this with the outfit. I mean, I don't think they were exactly sure whether I was serious or not.
I might just be scared of you with that outfit. Although
Yeah.
although you look good. You look like you're ready for one of the Burning Man parties
Yeah.
we were talking about
Yes.
a week or two ago.
Nick, there's a very interesting question that Eric Henderson has put in here
So,
that has to do
what I
with what's
Oh,
called
actually,
the
wait,
crisis
Andreas,
of replicability
Andreas, stop for a second. Peter's
in
asking
the
a question.
scientific method, and I'm wondering
Yeah.
if we could get to that one.
Yeah, actually, so it's been put up on the screen now. And I think it's a great question. You know, there's been a replicability crisis in all the sciences, actually, because it's not as sexy to repeat somebody else's scientific study and publish something about it. And in fact, in the behavioral science space, you know, there was a recent report where people tried to replicate a number of different things that were popularized, you know, between 2010, 2015. And they found that somewhere on the order of, I don't know, 13, 14% or more couldn't be replicated. And in a sense, the scientific method, this isn't the time for us to start questioning the scientific method. It's actually gotten us pretty far in society. But it is a great question. Like, what about this repeatability crisis in science in general? And how does that play into this time?
It is a trade-off. How do the traditional methods the drug authorities have to develop drugs and to try them? How, in a time when every day we are late, people die, how should we modify it?
Well, and I think, you know, Richard Feynman said, he gave a wonderful talk to the graduating class, probably at Caltech back in the 70s. You can find the manuscript online. And it was called Beware Cargo Cults. And it was about World War II and the cargo cults that emerged on the South Sea Islands. But his point was that a scientist first must question himself, like, because you would fool yourself too easily. And in fact, I think when Ting and I were talking, she said she did an experiment herself with trying to get herself to exercise based on one of the scientific evidence things. And she realized that was like, okay, that was on me, but I'm a scientist and I could fool myself. And so I think that intellectual humbleness to say, please, when you publish something with evidence, identify all the ways you could be wrong. Identify all the ways that you could be fooling yourself, because that feels like a very important component here.
Yeah, and I think it's also important to sort of test the theories in different contexts. It's almost like a, you know, robustness and rigor and generalizability, right? So sometimes we get so excited when we test you know, one hypothesis, but it was really under a particular context, and it could be a statistical, you know, accident that we find the results, and we don't, you know, we don't have incentive to repeat that, you know, study, because we already got, you know, the great news. And there's also this concept called self-confirmation bias, right? So sometimes you want to go for your hypothesis, your, you know, validating, you know, your prior intuition. So whenever you feel that, whenever it is confirming your intuition, your scientific intuition, even you stop sort of, you know, stress test it.
Stress testing,
yeah. So I do think that there's also human biases in this process, kind of as scientists ourselves.
Even as much as you want to be non-biased, we can't help ourselves. We grew up in a certain environment. We have a certain set of learnings. And that's why we need actually the whole community of scientists to be involved. And right now, the sort of publisher perish model, I don't want anyone to scoop my scientific inquiry. Actually, what's kind of interesting is I recently saw that the Department of Strategic Surprise, you know, the IARPAs and the DARPAs of the world, came out with something called polyplexus. And it's actually a conjecture platform to actually accelerate scientific conjecture by creating like tweets of micro publications. And the idea is take 2 or 3 micro publications where the scientist had to kind of boil down what they believe in a very short sentence, and then build a conjecture to actually say, in this case, based on the mission we're trying to do, I have a conjecture about this. So it's sort of almost a question of, could we use a different methodology for the scientific method that would learn from games, and actually they're planning on rolling in kind of reward mechanisms and things They famously did folding at home and some other things that actually helped in that space. So I think that's a great question, and I'm glad someone asked it.
Yeah.
This is tricky, and I think the first thing is honesty and explain everything that went wrong. Robustness, you mentioned, and rigor, like try it in different contexts because we are so context dependent. This might be a question for both Andreas and Ting. Andreas, I don't know if you're still there, but
yes, I'm here.
one of the things I learned when I was visiting some of the quantum computing startups, like Rigetti up in Berkeley and Microsoft up in Seattle, they were saying what's different about quantum computing is that, first of all, most of nature is quantum. Like nature's had 3 billion years to experiment, so it's taken advantage of everything it can in this process. But what they said was quantum computing, unlike classical computing, is high dimensionality, but doesn't necessarily need high data. And their point was sort of, look, a molecule that created the Haber-Bosch process is only 27 atoms, but there's no computer that could actually simulate it right now because we're converting from bits to try to figure out a quantum system called the Haber-Bosch process for making fertilizer, and then convert back, to things. Yet in the quantum space, it sort of is a search across very large, high dimensions. Do you think, I know this is a weird way to set this up, but do you think that quantum computing, if it were to be effective in some dimension in the next 20 years, will actually be able to be brought to bear, will be valuable when it's about the human system and about nature and behaviors, where it's so high dimensionality that any one objective function may not be effective?
Well, the honest answer is I have no idea.
Yeah, me neither.
I think what is important is that here in preparation for landing, we bring together what we really did in the last hour and 10 minutes. And for me, the curiosity and the willingness to learn from experiments, that is what my message is that I wanted to get across to your audience. So stay curious and observe yourself and observe this amazing opportunity, which we have once in our lifetime to really look at what's going on in the world. Enjoy. That's my...
And pay attention to this evidence around you. Ting, you talked a little bit about how we all could be doing some intentional experiments, either in our home workplaces or in our lives. Can you give us a little bit on what Andrea said about being curious and how we might actually learn right now?
I do want to challenge Andreas in adding the dimension besides curiosity is how to be also a bit more theories driven in our curious endeavor, right? So when we are looking at the context of working from home, so all companies now have to shift to that new normals, and there's a lot of efforts, put into helping their employees become more productive and in terms of well-being. But how many of the organizations and companies are designing their programs, helping employees improve productivity based on good data and based on scientific insights and evidence? So this is actually irrational capital. It's a bond that Dan created. That
can you pull that up on the screen? Yeah. So this is something that Dan Ariely, who created the lab and wrote the book Predictably Irrational, he created what is this exactly? What's irrational capital?
So he is investing in companies based on these behavioral factors. So he once had a study that looked at psychological well-being indicators of different companies, and he believes that these data matter much more than the financial performance data of companies. So he ended up creating this fund that works 12% better than S&P 500, right? So he ignored this fund basically ignored all the traditional sort of data that people have been looking at, and it turns out, like, if I ask you, like intuitively, which of the factors do you think are the ones that predict that there are these like black lines that are more on top, like performing better versus the other predicting the performance? It turns out that the blue factors are the ones that are better. that are
So
more important.
so if I understand this, it's like the ones in blue, like appreciate people's work.
Yeah.
That seems
Trust.
being transparent about management, even
Yeah.
now, management following through with what they said, don't change it, being open and fair, setting clear expectations. I mean, these seem like pretty good things, but in many cases, people tilt on other things, benefits and training and special recognition and stuff. But actually, it turns out honest mistakes valued turns out great. So Dan put together this fund. He called it Irrational Capital. The red line is the S&P 500. So his fund is outperformed not by looking at big data, like the market, but actually outperformed by looking at little data, like these kinds of how are they signaling in the way they communicate to their customers, and the way they communicate to their employees, and the way they communicate to the streets. And he's outperformed the S&P 500. I'm fascinated by this because I'd be curious to know, like, how Rational Capital is doing now. Like, how is Dan's fund doing? And what will that look like?
Yeah.
And what are the new indicators? Because these might change in a post-COVID world. But that's an example of let's
By the
be
way,
curious.
we had a huge one yesterday. The price of oil tanked. And that, a lot of people think that is a predictor of, or the market internalizing the fact that there won't be new auto sales, that manufacturing will be down, right? So there's a lot of signals, I think, coming from different markets that are trying to tell us things. And of course, Dan synthesized that. And I think part of what this shows us is the globe at a time of so much change. There's just so many interesting data forms to look at. This is what Andreas pointed out earlier with all of this effluent data. And I think the other thing we've learned today, to pick up on what you said, Andreas, is that there's a great march of science going on now. When we started the show, our whole point was we wanted to dig under the surface and look at what we thought was a burst of innovation going on at this time of COVID. Because, if you watch the news, it's the president yelling at the governor and where are the ventilators, and then the left and the right disagree about what reopening looks like. But underneath that, a lot of the science stuff, and one of the groups, Mick, that you and I are particularly impressed with is the Santa which is a founder of complexity science. Complexity science, of course, are these complex adaptive systems where there are many different components to it, and often you don't know which input brings about great output. But Omid, if we can bring up that slide, they have just been putting together a ton of papers, predicting, understanding how the how the disease vectors are traveling, and this has been kind of a burst of energy in the kind of a cross discipline in science. And if you scroll down there, you can just see some of the topics that, they basically been putting out a paper every 2 or 3 days. So I think part of one of the things that we want to start digging into here is there is this kind of convergence of a number of scientific and experimental processes that we're probably increasingly going to be using because, today is Earth Day, right? 50 years ago, we kind of got into this awareness of the environment, and that's been a slow-moving crisis, and that we've had these models that predict change. We're just getting used to them, and perhaps both parties now agree on that. This crisis is 100 days old, 100 days old, and we're making decisions very, very quickly. We're making decisions faster than a lot of people are comfortable with. It turns out it's based on science, and I think, for the near future, there's a lot to dig into here, and this is probably also a very important time for science and communication, because I think for good decision making, a lot of people have to become more comfortable with what's going on here. So I want to thank everybody for participating. We're about 18 minutes over now. Andreas, thank you for once again sharing that the world is a giant experiment, and I know this is the largest one you've had to work with yet, bigger even than Amazon. Ting,
Peter.
Ting, we want to follow up because you now have this giant experiment launching with Dutch TV, which we'd like to replicate with our audience and in the U.S. This whole question about behavioral mechanisms. And Mick, we will continue this on Friday as we go deeper into kind of these mechanisms and the underlying science that suddenly have gone from what went on perhaps in universities and government labs to something that affects us on the news every night, which is a different state of being than we were in even a few months ago.
Yeah, well, and I'm hoping that what we can do on Friday is just share some of the interesting tools that people are starting to use, sort of cool tools in the current state. We've been using this whiteboard that's an infinite whiteboard. Omid, can you pull that up? Where, I tried to catch, there's Andreas zapping people over there, but we try to catch what's going on. this is an example of a shared cognitive space for actually all the episodes. And the question is sort of what other cool tools are out there? How can we use things that are sort of people in the same place at the same time versus different place, same time, or different place, different time? And what are some of the other tools out there that we're all starting to use? And what are maybe some ones that we don't know about that could help us in this bizarre time? And the reason I think cool tools is an interesting topic here for our show is that tools shape the way you think. You know, it relates back to both what Andreas and Ting have talked about. If I'm a hammer, everything looks like a nail. And virtuosos who really are expressive and do things bend tools. You know, Jimi Hendrix bends that guitar and makes it talk. And so how do we help, don't just accept the tools for the way they are, but how do we help put positive pressure on to actually give us the tools we need and bend and break those so that we can actually thrive in the future as well? And so I think we're wrapped up. Thanks, everybody.
Thank you. That was
thanks for staying for overtime.
Yeah. Listen, I want to thank you all. And we'll be back Friday taking a look at tools. You can look at all of the past episodes at quarantine.today, going back to our first episode with Andrew Hessel on synthetic biology. Probably he has access to some of the coolest tools of all. And we've looked both at the science of this and also kind of at the spirituality of all of this. Thank you for coming to Quarantine for this, our 10th show. And we'll see you again in a couple of days.
Let's get close, but not so close. Quarantine. You can share from a distance. Quarantine. You know we want to see each other. You'll have to stay in your quarantine space while we talk.